Hello, people. I'm Frank Allen, and this is Whirling Circles Internal Martial Arts Podcast. Today, my guest co host is Jonathan Molnar, Wudong Physical Culture Association instructor, senior student, longtime friend and traveling partner of myself and Tina, and close friend of Sean's. Unfortunately, Sean will not be with us today because he has the COVID blues. Hello, John. How you doing?
I'm good, Frank. Great introduction.
Um, Before we get into our main topic today, I want to spend a little time on UFC 257 because we did do that whole prelude show a couple of weeks ago. And it opened by saying Dana did a really good job. I actually felt like I got my $70 worth, which I was a little skeptical of. I was greatly amused by the fights that could have been a WWE storyline. They had such baby faces and heels to them. Baby face goes to good guys and heels are bad guys, including the main event. You don't get more of a baby face than Dustin Poirier. Family man, quiet, polite, philanthropist, has his own fundraising for poor people and various things, and actually is more involved in how his life goes outside of the cage and helping people than he is in the cage. And of course, Conor McGregor is the ultimate heel of all sports between his megalomania and his criminal activities, um, throwing steel dollies through bus windows full of UFC fighters just because somebody badmouthed his friend, the Russian Irishman Artem Levov, punching old men in bars because they don't want to drink his horrible tasting whiskey, destroying fans' phones who want to have pictures taken with him just because he's in a bad mood. Um, he's the ultimate heel. So I must say, I thoroughly, it would have been worth my $70 just to see him look like he was napping on the mat with his hand behind his head and really looked like he decided to lay down and take a nap on the mat. It was wonderful. And of course, Dustin fought a brilliant, brilliant fight. And then before that, you had JoJo Calderwood versus Jessica the Evil Eye. And the Evil Eye apparently is the Evil Eye. Uh, Word is that she's horribly disrespectful and impolite and just a really bad person in the locker room that no one likes her at all. And JoJo, of course, is the ultimate good girl. She's got that sweet little voice with that Scottish accent and her little blonde braids and looks like this cute little thing and then has wicked Muay Thai. And it was a really good fight, actually, with JoJo's knees versus Jessica's short boxing, but JoJo outstruck her about 3-1 and walked away with it, and that was great. And Chandler coming in and knocking out poor Dan Hooker was good for Bellator. Most of the guys from Bellator that came over blew it. Um, Will Brooks was actually one of the guys that beat Chandler and came over as a lightweight champion before this and just got creamed over and over again, disappeared. I haven't heard of him fighting anywhere. So Chandler at least got off to a good start, which was good. And then Juliana Penne, the Venezuelan vixen, beating Sarah McMahon in the prelims was quite enjoyable also. Sarah McMahon being a Olympic silver medal wrestler and Juliana being primarily a jiu-jitsu player, but being overall turned into a very good overall fighter. And I decided I really liked her because I saw her doing commentary on the Combate show, and she's turned out to be quite a real and regular person. So I enjoyed that fight also. Overall, I thought Dana came through with something that was actually worth our money. Did you see that show, John?
I did not. I was following the results sort of on bloody elbow just to, like check back every 5 minutes to see if another round has gone down, that kind of thing. But it sounds like a show I would have really liked to have seen, especially seeing the Chandler fight and of course, the main event would have been really interesting. Was the main event? I'm reading like Portier really surprised him with his kicking game. Like he really messed up McGregor's legs early on. Is that the
Oh, he totally took out his lead leg. He had him limping, but why wasn't he ready? It's almost like he was just starting training because he thought he was going to box Pacquiao and didn't pay any attention to Poirier. Oh, I knocked him out before. And Poirier's an overall fighter. He should have been ready for it. Everybody these days are using those calf kicks. So, he gave it a try and found McGregor wide open for it. So he opened up. And when he knocked McGregor out, McGregor was actually starting to limp.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, he took the leg out nicely
Okay. It
and
seems
then finished him off beautifully.
because we've certainly seen some fights that went on for many, many rounds where one fighter just had a leg just completely destroyed. Like Uriah Faber, I think, had his leg really messed up by, oh God, the Brazilian Muay Thai guy. But basically, there's been a number of fights where it actually went for many rounds that way and somebody really took a beating. But it sounds like this Portier followed it up. He took away the movement and then used that advantage to knock him out or to get was it a TKO or an actual knockout?
He was out. Like
Okay.
I said, he looked like he was taking a nap on the mat. Yeah, Poirier just had it all over. He was ready. He was ready to do anything. He was expecting a tougher fight from McGregor, I think, and he was just really on that night, which is a thing of beauty. So, for our main topic today, we're going to be working on the concept of home training programs. What do you do at home to be an adjunct to what you do in the school? And I think a lot of Japanese martial arts actually work on the idea that you're supposed to be in the dojo 4 or 5, 6 times a week, and that's where you do your training. In fact, the ones with mat work, judo, jujitsu, aikido, and whatnot, it's almost necessary because you need a partner and you need a mat, and who can do that at home? And the karate schools seem to follow through. That's the Japanese thing, be in the dojo. I know people are really serious in the dojo twice a day. Chinese martial arts has always had an adjunct of home training. It's always you go to class to learn what to practice. You go to class to learn your new stuff. You go to class to have partners to work with your two-person stuff. And then you work your basic training at home. And a good instructor can always tell who's doing it and who isn't just by watching how they move and the differences or non differences of what happens when they come to class. But it's a standard part of Chinese martial arts for a long, long time now. Back in the days when Chinese martial arts was vocational training, you didn't have to worry about going home. Most of them lived at the school because you'd train at the school and you'd work for the teacher's security guard company and you were there all the time anyway, so it didn't make much difference. But ever since probably almost 100 years ago, with the advent of the Qingwu Physical Culture Association in Shanghai, a major part of Chinese martial arts is training at home.
Well, so certainly my own personal experience follows that completely. I did karate, Okinawan karate, from junior high through high school. And we literally trained from 2 to 3 hours a night, 5 to 6 days a week. So there literally was, I mean, I suppose we could have trained at home in addition. I remember training at home when I first started, when you're learning new movements, but realistically, you're getting a lot of training in just in the dojo. And then when I came to train with you, it was very obvious early on that there was a lot of very technical material. Like you get shown something, but it's going to take a lot of time to actually acquire the skill. Whether it was something like the standing or like the basic qigongs that were to develop your coordination of movement, continuous flow, all of those types of things. There's a lot of technical long-term practice involved in Chinese martial arts that's not just repetitive motion. Like the karate had just a lot more doing forms or working on your punching. but you didn't pick apart movement and you didn't pick apart sort of neurological functions the same way that you do in Chinese internal martial arts. So uh, this is actually, I think, a really valuable discussion for anyone practicing this stuff to think about how they practice both in the school and then at home, because most of your work should be being done on your own. Uh,
Well, these days, when I first started training, we used to do those things in the studio.
okay.
But number one, none of our teachers were making their living at it. And number two, the only people there were people that were dead serious. There was no one coming just to get a workout. There was no one coming just for the social gathering. Everybody that was there was dead serious. So we were doing our standing, we were doing our repetitive motions over and over again. We were doing it in the studio, and we still did it at home. Even though a lot of times we were in the studio for 3, 4, 5 times a week, you still practiced at home, and the teacher still expected you to practice at home. I think one of the most important things of practicing this stuff at home, though, is you can't get caught up in time stuff. I've seen so many people end up not getting to practice in because they think, oh, yes, it's Chinese martial arts. I should do 2 hours at dawn and 2 hours at dusk. Well, it doesn't happen. Most of today's busy people, it's not going to happen. I've told my students for years, practice every day, whatever you can get in. If you've got an hour in the morning, wonderful. Got 2 hours in the evening, great. You've got 15 minutes at lunchtime, take it. Get your body into the idea that you're going to practice every day and don't worry about how much. Do what you can do. And as your body gets used to it and starts to crave it, you'll end up finding ways to get more. But just whatever time you have, take it. Like I said, if you only got 10 or 15 minutes at lunch and your day's that busy, well, do that as long as you get it in. The other thing is when you're doing these things with a teacher, you're getting corrected continuously, and it makes a big difference. And like standing in particular, I know too many people that get into standing at home and all it is time. Oh, I can stand for 20 minutes and they can only stand for 10. I can stand for a half hour. I can stand for a whole hour. Well, guess what? If you're standing for 5 minutes in posture and the rest of it's slightly out of posture, you're not only not progressing, you're regressing. It's detrimental to stand in bad posture. So you stand as long as you can stand in proper posture. And one of the best ways we came up to do that is using mirrors. And if you've got two mirrors, good, one to the front and one to the side. But if you only got one mirror, put it to the side because that's how you can see the line of your back. If you're facing the mirror, you don't see the line of your back. The mirror on the side is the best way to stand properly. And once you realize that your spinal alignment is going out because you're too tired to hold it the way you're supposed to because you haven't drilled it in yet, stop. It doesn't do you any good to stand out of posture. None. So that was the advantage of doing this stuff in class is the teacher was correcting you all the time. You know, you stood in posture because he was putting you in posture. And so it's important to train, but it's important to train properly.
So let me ask you a question about this, Frank, because there's two practices that come to mind immediately. One is standing, and the other is the static posture walking in Baguizhang, which is sort of the equivalent for Baguizhang in terms of training methods. In my experience, and I'm not saying it's correct, but I feel like as you practice, if you're paying attention to what you're doing and you're starting to get the feeling of it, that there is some neurological practice that actually assists that. And so, for instance, walking in heaven posture, if you start feeling that flow of heaven energy going up and out through your arms, I feel like that's actually somewhat self-correcting. Like it's actually it's guiding you that this is that you're doing it correctly, and it also allows you to go longer. and I've had similar experiences with the static, just the postures, um, where I mean, certainly before I practiced my longer personal practice, I had already done quite a bit of standing with you because back when we started, I think many classes started with 20 minutes of standing and awakening the nervous system, sort of paying attention to what's going on in your own body. So I had a foundation already, but when I started working on it at home and developing the practice, I felt like the more relaxed you became, the more you became aware of something like, okay, too much tension um, in my glutes or too much tension in my shoulders. And those actually would relax and allow the posture to become more, um, well, it at least felt like more full, more open for the flow of energy in the body. Do you not? I mean, I guess I would say that the longer practice, I felt like it became less necessary to constantly watch on the side. That the processes in the body seemed to start to open up the body itself. Um, but would you say that that's like imagination? Because that's fair if it's just internal imagination.
Well, for some people it is. I mean, generally, if your body gets tired of holding something, it slips, and your mind can tell you it's still there. And it depends. Like you said, you had a good solid base before you started doing this, but you really need to monitor things. That's why, you're in class, you still have, how many times are you standing, you thought you were doing well with that Tai Chi stance in China, and then Li Bing Su would come along and start to correct you. Think of that for a minute.
Right.
Um, and that's me too. I mean, Lee would correct us all. But yeah, a lot of times you're not as correct as you think you are. And the mirror on the side can help. But in general, once you reach a point where at a certain point of fatigue, maybe you can't hold it absolutely correctly anymore. And your mind can tell you still are, but if you're not, it's detrimental. You're training yourself into bad posture. So it's really good to train as hard as you can train correctly. It's that old Hanny Calder rule, slowly and carefully, first correct, then fast. You got to get the correct thing because Tai Chi takes that, never does the fast. But
Well, at least
um,
practice, right?
well, inform,
Right.
inform. Once you get into anything that's competitive two person, that's really competitive two person, you have to have speed. But the whole idea of Tai Chi is by that point you have drilled the basics and the principles deep into your body that when you speed up, they keep going. And but it really you have to be sure that you're doing this stuff correctly. That correct is more important than how long is what I'm getting at. If you know it's correct and it really is correct, the longer you go, of course, the better. But you can't substitute length for precision. You need to be precise. And another thing with these basics, with our principles, which we're going to do a thing on principles, I think next week. But with the principles, you've got the static principles: posture, breathing, vision, mindset. Well, the big thing with them is they're supposed to be integrating into your daily life until eventually that's how you always stand. That's how you always breathe. That's how you always look. That's how you always think. And once you reach that point, you don't need to train them as much. You don't need to be standing for a half hour or an hour or whatnot if you do that generally in your daily life. You need to do it like a booster shot, but you don't need to do it the same way that you did at the beginning. But as I've discovered as the decades go on and your body changes, you have to go back through and redo it over again because body changes like putting on 50, 60, 70 pounds can change stuff directly and quite drastically. And you have to go back and redo everything over again. So you also have to be aware of those kind of changes also.
Spinal alignment
Um,
feel the same when you've got like a counterweight pulling you forward, or
no, that's the thing. Um, so there constant work on this stuff. But the thing that I like to get is make sure that you do it every day. Don't just blow it off because you don't have as much time as you think you do, and do stuff correctly. Don't drill in bad habits. And then the person has to work out their own personal training, and that's a really important part of this personal training at home. Is in class you're always working for what's the average best for everyone in class, or even if we separate it into a couple of groups, the advanced people and the beginning people, it's the mean of what's best for that group. And one of the major things of having your own home practice is doing working on exactly what you personally need. And you have to figure out what that is, or talk to your instructor and have him help you, her help you figure out what it is that you need. But that's one of the whole things of a home personal practice, is that it should be personal. You don't just do what you're doing in class because that was for everybody. You do whatever your personal development requires that moment.
I think that's actually a very interesting point, because the idea of self-reflection and self-evaluation, I think, is a lot of people miss. Not just in the big topics of like, okay, I really need to work on something like spinal alignment or hip tuck or something like that, but in moment to moment practice, like whether you're in class. I know that some people hate when you go to a foundations class and we're walking, doing like static posture walking for a reasonably long amount of time. Say that we're doing 20 minutes to half an hour. For me, that is time where you work on, like, how is my walking? How is the stability of my mud tread step? Um, how is the height? Can I work on middle basin walking instead of just walking in high basin? Extension, expansion through the joints, all of those things. That's what I work on when it's this like very basic foundational training. Is I'm trying to constantly think, what's going on in my body right now? What's the quality of this movement? Can I work more on coil here? Um, and I think that well, it's a struggle for everyone to not tune out. You're bored with it. Well, you're only bored if you're tuning out. If you're actually engaged with what you're doing, you don't get bored, because there's sort of an infinite amount of nuance in this stuff to examine and correct. Um, and it applies both in training in this classroom and at home. Um, so you have to be self-reflective.
Well, it goes with internal martial arts. It's mindful training is basic training. And it's because of the difference of internal and external. Being external develops unconscious reflexive action. And internal is all supposed to be conscious action. Conscious action is mindful movement. That's exactly, they're synonymous. That's what it is. It's being in the movement, thinking of what you're doing when you do it. It's like I'm always having to point out to people that conscious action is not playing chess. You're not going moves ahead. And it's certainly not worrying about what happened. It's being in the here and now all the time and consciously, mindfully doing what you are doing. And of course, with my fighters, I'm always having to point out, look, don't worry about what just happened. That's the past. And don't be planning ahead. That's the future. Be doing what you're doing and letting one movement flow to the next mindfully, but with avoiding past future, like Wu Wei meditation, being in the here and now and avoiding past, future, and fantasy. But it's sometimes hard for fighters to get it that the previous technique is a past and the next technique is a future. That you're mindfully in the moment. So this whole mindful training and paying attention to what you're doing is a basic training of a basic concept of internal martial arts.
So then, okay, just a nuanced question there, because I want to make sure that I understand this. If the instructor makes a correction, or if, say, you're fighting and someone's going for that low kick, you can be consciously aware that this is something you need to be prepared for, or to some extent, but it's different than anticipating it, or do you understand what I'm saying? Like, so in the McGregor fight, when those leg kicks started coming in and they had some success, he should have adapted and started checking them or whatever, so that they didn't continue.
He
Which,
should he should have been mindfully aware of them coming and mindfully checking them. My bet is that he was thinking about his next punching combination.
okay,
He was thinking about his next technique instead of being mindfully in the moment. That in that moment, Poirier was tearing his leg off. And
okay,
therefore, he should have been working on checking those kicks instead of trying to think of what he could do to injure Poirier. As we know, and a check can be a weapon itself. Ask
oh,
Anderson Silva.
yeah, absolutely, yeah, for sure. And something that I don't think many of the MMA fighters really do those checks as dangerously. Like, you don't see that result nearly as often in MMA as you do in something like kickboxing. There's a number of kickboxers who have gotten uh, their kicking leg broken by someone checking, right?
Well, the Thais in particular learned this hard check because it's not just a check, it's specifically what's known as a hard check, which is you take the big, heaviest part of your shin and specifically check the lower middle part of their shin. So you take the strongest part of your shin and check the weakest part of their shin. But nobody but the Thais works on working their shins until they're dead anyway, till there's no feeling left in them whatsoever, which the Thais do by starting out as young kids
Right.
and banging their shins all the time. So it's a whole different thing with a real Thai trained Thai fighter. But that's a whole thing. It's a technique that actually was used on Anderson Silva, where it actually was a placed hard check,
Hmm.
where the strongest part of your bone hits the weakest part of their bone.
Right. And used by somebody who was not as heavily trained in Muay Thai as Anderson. I mean, Anderson Silva's background was Muay Thai, so it's kind of pretty impressive that a Muay Thai fighter got stopped with a technique that, from a non-Muay Thai fighter, that's normally associated with Muay Thai. But
Yeah, but Anderson Silva was always a bit fancy and flashy and not doing basic Muay Thai. And it was interesting. And when his leg broke, he like totally lost it. He was sitting there screaming. And 2 weeks later, I wish you could think of the guy's name, a famous Thai boxer
Spong,
from,
wasn't it Spong?
oh, Tyrone Spong. The same thing happened to Tyrone Spong a few weeks later. And we just seen Silva sitting there screaming, and Tyrone Spong sitting there like, not a sound. Just, it's like, so some people have better pain tolerance than other people also.
Yeah, I
Um,
kind of feel like you don't know until you have that moment either, though. Like, like you can have been hurt some other way and been like, yeah, okay, whatever. But until your shin is snapped in half, I don't think you know if you're gonna how you're gonna respond to that.
well, that's like when Sakuraba broke Henzo Gracie's arm and broke it really ugly looking. And Sakuraba, who broke it, freaked out and was screaming for the doctor. And Henzo was sitting there, same as Spong, like, it's like, so different people have different pain tolerance and react to this stuff differently. But I never saw Anderson Silva as a solid Thai boxer. He reminds me more of the karate fighters.
Okay.
You know,
Um, what do you think are areas that people are best trained at home? So standing is one obvious one. Maybe some of the things like your what's the exercise called where it's continuous movement and everything has to start and stop at the same time? You know what I'm talking about. You were working on it in some classes recently.
Yeah, actually, we've been doing it in the fighting principles class.
Okay.
And I've made it a point to take away the name that was given to it when it
Okay.
was taught to me
Okay.
because it gets too confusing for people. It was
Gotcha.
taught to me as cloud hands.
Oh,
And
okay.
I was making a point not to say that when one of my students had been around for a long time, said, "Isn't this cloud hands?" And instantly one of the beginners lost it and started doing this.
Okay.
It's like,
So,
it's like, and it's a Qigong cloud hands. And that particular teacher actually used to use it in one of his forms. I think one of the ones that he made up. But it's an exercise for the unity of movement principle. Like I said, we're going to do a show on principles.
mhm.
But yes, that kind of thing, working on your principles is very good. But the reality is for your home practice, like I said, it's what you personally need. And you can do anything that's a solo practice, anything that doesn't require another person. If you're working on a new form and it's brand new to you and you've never done it, I would recommend working on it at home in your home practice. That's making sure that you know the moves that you've been taught in class so that the class can move on and learn new moves without, half the people stand there looking like what the hell is going on because they don't remember the previous moves. I think it behooves people when learning new forms to do that in their home practice. You can do anything and everything that is done one person. Also, the more you go on, the more stuff you have to pick and choose what you want to work on, what you need that day, what's new, what you need to go back and revisit. And it's so much. I mean, when you reach the point where, like some of us can say to people, I've forgotten more forms than you ever learned,
Right.
you really have to start picking and choosing stuff because there's no way you could work on everything. You could
I,
work 23 hours a day and not work on everything I've been through.
I felt
Um,
so good when Liu Jingru pulled out the notes when he was teaching. Was it the 64?
Palms.
Yeah, it was the 64 poems, and I was like, yes, even he doesn't remember this just off the top of his head.
But he's done that with other stuff. I mean, I think he was using notes for Bagua Spear. And there have been a few things that he pulls out his notes, which is, but the thing is, having a set of notes, whether you pull them out or whether you go over them before you go to class, is anybody that's done this stuff long enough has it. We didn't know about BP Chan until we started getting invited to his house. And then we saw this row of these leather bound books with nothing on the bindings. And somebody's, "Oh, Mr. Chan, what's that?" His notes. He had these specific leather bound notebooks with notes that he'd been keeping his whole career. I mean, they were thick books and there was a whole row of them. I think he had notes from the time he was like 12 years old.
That's awesome.
And, he was in his late 50s then. He had notes on everything, everything. And I'm sure some of this stuff he pulled out because some of the stuff he was teaching was not his main personal things. His main personal things were Yang style Tai Chi and Qigong. But of course, the minute William Chen heard that he knew Bagua and Xing Yi, he wanted him to teach Bagua and Xing Yi. So he got them all back together. But I don't know that he was practicing them just before that. They weren't his main studies. His main studies were Yang style Tai Chi and particularly medical Qigong.
Have you ever kept like a training journal? I know you keep notes. We see that all the time in China, but like a training journal to sort of track progress or chat or make notes about things that you want to work on. Has that been something you've ever worked with or?
I think maybe, 35 or 40 years ago, but nothing recently. In fact, God only knows where they went to.
Okay.
Um, yeah, it's not one of my things. Um, my memory's been pretty good for that. It's just I need notes on specifics of form movements and specifics of exercises. But as far as when I trained what and who I learned it from and how it progressed, so far so good.
Do you
But
know?
it's to get back to our home training program. It's really important for people to individualize this. Is what I'm getting at. You have to figure out what you need to work on, and you need to work on what you need for your progression and your development. That's why it's home personal practice, because you have to personalize it. And you don't want to, just do what your friends are doing or just do what's in class. You have to really go over stuff in your mind and figure out what you need to work on for your personal progression and then work on it and work on it correctly and work on it daily if possible, taking whatever time you have. But I think that's really an important part of this stuff to make the personal practice personal.
Um, I'm trying to think. Is there any internal martial arts that have kept that type of training journal? Like, did any of the Sun Ludan did? I know he has a lot of books and different things, but he had notes and things as well, right? That have been published. I know Bruce Lee did, but he's in sort of a different category of martial artists. I'm just curious because it's an interesting topic still to see how somebody who became great achieved it. Not that it'll be the same path for you, but um,
Um, I don't really know. I haven't seen anybody. By the way, Bruce Lee, as far as I know, those notes were from a specific 7 month period.
okay,
I mean, he studied his whole life, but what happened was he was really hyper. There's no way in his daily life he was going to sit down and do all that writing and notes and whatnot. He was a very, very hyper guy, little tiny hyper person. Then he injured his back. Unlike the movie Not Fighting One Jack Man, he injured his back doing his weight training with James Lee. James Lee used to invent these different weighted exercises, and they used to do them. And at one point, he really wrecked his back to the point where he spent 7 months in bed. Part of it in the hospital, a lot of it in traction
okay,
to get his back together. And being hyper and having to lay there, and when he's in traction, he can't even move around in bed. He needed to do something. So he started writing everything down and drawing the pictures and whatnot because he had to be moving somehow. And that's where he made all of these notes and drawings and really cool stuff. But it's because he was a hyper guy who was suddenly nailed in place and had to do something. So he did that. And in fact, legend has it that when he was done, his wife said, "This is great. Let's put it together and make a book." And he said, "No way. No way. I've developed a system of not having a style, of going from style to style to style and personally picking out what works for you, training it till you know it, and then moving on to the next one and doing the same thing until you develop a fighting system of techniques that work for you personally. And it's not supposed to be a style. Well, if my stuff went down in a book, it'd become a style. No, there's no way." And as I understand it, he was dead about 2 weeks when his wife Linda called in an author to take his notes, organize them, and write the Tao of Jeet Kune Do. Of course, he had just died in his Hong Kong girlfriend's apartment, so perhaps Linda wasn't feeling too benevolent. But
okay,
that's where the Tao of Jeet Kune Do came from. And as we know, Jeet Kune Do is now a style.
right, right. The danger of following someone's training notes too carefully.
Well, it's just not what he wanted.
Hmm.
It's a style that works for some people, but he wanted a concept. His whole idea used to say over a concept, not a style. And it definitely got turned into a style.
Okay.
But no, I keep notes on forms and exercises, and I got a file cabinet and
I
whatever.
love
But
the idea of being organized and sort of having a sense of progression, but I'm not nearly that organized. I'm not even as organized as having all the notes from like I've probably taken notes on dozens of workshops that I've done with you, but are they all compiled in a book? No, that would require Kate. Kate is the one who has all the notes, probably dated and in order and with like clip notes or footnotes. So
Yeah,
organization,
Kate is stuff that I don't have.
yeah,
Kate's the number one organizer. She's sort of a Wudang Physical Culture Association archivist in that way. But no, it's good to have notes because when you decide that something's slipping and your personal practice, it's time to go back and work on it. It's good to have the notes to be able to go and find it so that you can work on it. Because these days, it's also good if you happen to have a film archive. Like there's a couple of the newer forms that I've got to get into notes because I've been going by the recording clips that we did of Leo when he taught us.
okay,
But but you know my note taking process in China, rough notes in the park, smooth them out some in the hotel, come
right,
home and do them really smooth and type them out, and that becomes a learning process for me. Like if people see me in China, I look like one of the most horrible students, and usually 3 months later, I'm the guy teaching the form that everybody else forgot.
right, right,
But but you know that's just my process. But again, that's my personal practice. You have to figure out what you need in your personal practice, and as I said, you really need to work the principles, which we will be getting into what those are, I think, in our next podcast in detail. That you really need to work the principles until they're drilled completely into your body and mind, and then you need to keep up on your forms, your techniques, the various other things of anything that you can do by yourself, you can do in your personal practice at home. And because you happen to live with somebody that trains, you can do the two-person stuff also.
yep,
That's sometimes a pretty big if.
right. Not too many of us are that lucky. Um, yeah, I mean, at some point in our trips to China, I sort of threw my metaphorical hands up and sort of went, okay, learn it while you're here, pay attention, keep working on principles inside of all of this, but don't expect to have this on automatic replay. Uh, there's a lot of material. So the stuff that I work on the most, I mean, anything we're working on. I can go into one of your classes for a form that I'm not familiar with or have largely forgotten, and still work on the the principles inside of that, and still have a very productive class. Um, but in terms of actually recalling everything, oh, that 64 palms really taught me I'm not going to remember all of this.
And
So
again, anything that you work enough, you start to remember. Like I've got a much better grasp on the 64 palms now, teaching it regularly for a long time than I did certainly when we came home from China those 2 years,
right,
which
right,
was it was pretty amazing to get it in 2 years. If I remember correctly, we got the singles and the doubles one year and the next 48 the next year. Um,
yes,
which is yeah, we tend to tries to give us whole pieces and counts on us going home and developing it. He knows that we're not going to get everything down pat in that amount of time, but we only have X amount of time and we travel around the world to train with him. He's really, really good at giving us whatever we want and counting on the fact that we will go home and work on it and smooth it out and get it down. And again, personal practice. And everybody needs to have one if you're going to develop in internal martial arts. It's one of the big differences between Chinese internal martial arts and the Japanese styles. And to some extent, I would imagine the more external, internal styles. As I said, every good Chinese martial art has an internal component to it. But I think that the Hung Gar and the Wing Chun and the Choi Lei Fut and the Long Fist and that those guys tend to do more similar training to the Japanese guys, more time in the Kwoon and less time actual training at home. Although I would imagine they do some home training also, but just it isn't as paramount to the style, to the foundations of the style as it is in Chinese internal martial arts.
So let me ask you actually about sort of long-term training and sort of a sense of how your training has progressed. Like there's ebbs and flows in people's training typically as different periods of their lives have different stressors and different things going on. Were there any like periods for you that were highly productive over other parts, or were there any particular areas that were more challenging to train and then you picked up again after? Or
Yeah, well, it goes with the ebb and flow of your life, as you said. In the more stable parts of your life, it's easy to have stable training. When things start getting unstable in your life, divorces, place changes, job changes, when your life gets bumpy, your training tends to get bumpy. And actually, the more you can force yourself to train in those times, the better you feel. But that's easier said than done. So all of that's happened to me as I went along. As you know, I've had sort of bumpy ride, but very interesting. The only time it worked opposite was when I had my big divorce from the person I was actually married to. I moved into my studio with a bunch of guys living there. So all of a sudden, that was just the opposite. We were training day in and day out most of the day long. But generally, when you have something that happens like that, some kind of life crisis, you're as much as the more you can train in your life crisis, the easier it is to get through it. But it's very difficult. That's usually when you train less. And of course, we know in certain energetic practices, if you can train during a difficult time, you can actually accomplish stuff in a more intense manner in a shorter amount of time than you can in the easy times. But of course, it's a lot more difficult, particularly like our practice of breaking up energy blockages. If you can do that, well, things are really bad and energy blockages are happening. Well, I was taught that you can do in 10 months what it would take you 10 years in an easy time if you can do it. But that's a really big if. So, yeah, I find the ebbs and flows of my training routines follow the ebbs and flows of my life in general. And I would imagine that's what works with everyone.
okay, yeah, what you were saying about having great opportunities and sort of, isn't there there's like a Chinese character that means something like both instability and opportunity? It's something like this. There's this concept, and I think it comes from a particular character, that only in times of instability do you have the greatest opportunity for growth. And I've always thought of it sort of as there are various things in your life, what almost like maybe like the Norns with the ideas of the threads of fate, and there are points at which you have a convergence, and you can often actually tell that you're in this spot that is highly stressful and that you are being given an opportunity to work on something, and that you can make a lot of progress in that time. Um, so that's actually an interesting thing to hear you say, because that's something I've definitely, not necessarily in martial arts, although I'm sure it can apply to martial arts too, but just in life in general, an awareness that there are times that are stressful where, it may last for a few weeks or a few months or maybe a few years, but that you can actually make a lot of growth and a lot of progress at that particular time. Um,
Well, that's a Taoist principle. A basic principle taught in Taoism is that every obstruction, every difficult time period presents an opportunity
okay.
of some point. That's a Taoist principle that every difficult time presents an opportunity to progress, presents an opportunity to get things done that you couldn't in another time. And also goes back, you've heard me talk about the riddle of steel, how everybody watches Conan and nobody understands the riddle of steel, but how the riddle of steel is that iron is brittle and will not hold an edge. And you beat it and you heat it and you chill it and you beat it and you heat it and you chill it. And through the process, iron becomes steel. It gets tempered. Through its tempering, it becomes steel, flexible, and able to hold an edge. And with a person, the tempering is the hardships in their life. That the hardships in your life temper you. And if you don't have any hardships, you never get tempered because the tempering is what allows a person to be flexible and able to hold an edge. And of course, it was just the parable of the whole movie put together and looked at as a whole, so nobody gets it because everybody says all these anomalies and parables about the riddle of steel without ever going into what I just said, which is you got to look at the picture of the whole movie to see the thing. But that's it. The tempering of a person makes them flexible and able to hold an edge. And that also goes with me telling my people, and less getting into it these days, but telling my people for ages it's the big advantage of contact sparring is learning to be able to maintain your internal principles while you are doing contact sparring. Because maintain them while a friend of yours is trying to punch you with some padded gloves on is a lot easier than maintaining it through an actual life crisis. And if you can't maintain your internal principles in a sparring situation, it's going to be very, very difficult to maintain them in a life crisis. And there are other ways to do it besides sparring. I mean, there are Chinese people who do it by going out and gambling more than they can afford to lose. Or you could go skydiving, or you could go bungee jumping, and get into that stuff. And actually, contact sparring is one of the safest, most dangerous methods that you could do this stuff. But
Right.
the idea is being able to maintain your internal principles so that you can maintain them when a life crisis comes along. And of course, the step up from that is your life crises are simply training for the day you die. If you can't maintain your internal principles through a life crisis, you will definitely freak out when that time comes. And there's no avoiding that one. And that's why another Taoist principle is that a really, really easy life is a curse because you can't avoid, as Mr. Chan would say, getting the invitation. And so if you've never had any life crises and you never pushed yourself through hard times, you're going to be kind of screwed when that moment comes up. Even though, as Chan also used to say, everybody gets the invitation, but we do have exercise, so it always comes a little later. But even if it comes later, it's going to come. And putting yourself through hardship to deal with the hardships that come upon you is the tempering that prepares you for that moment.
So I think we're starting to wind down, but there were two specific things I wanted to bring up during this. One of them is a BP Chan quote, which I'll remind you of what it is, but I think it's a great quote for the idea of internal practice. Something about everybody asks how many years you've trained.
Oh, another BP Chan wisdom was everybody asks, how many years have you trained? That's not the question. Question should be, how many hours have you practiced? That was another BP Chan wisdom. We have little bits of BP Chan's wisdom that pop out every now and then, and that's definitely one of them. And that fits right in with this home training program. The question is not how many years have you trained. The question is how many hours have you practiced?
Yeah. And the other thing is not a quote, but I mean, Tina's the only one who could maybe quote it. But remember when we were doing cloud hands with Liebens in China? I think it was in the green room. Remember the room with the green floor?
Oh
Uh,
yeah, the
and,
office gym.
and he stopped the grand master of Wu style Tai Chi stopped and was like, oh, I've been doing this cloud hands for 70 years. I think I just got it. Something like this. Do you remember this moment? It was
Yes,
like this. I
yes,
mean,
I do.
years
And
was about, but it was like,
those epiphanies can definitely come up at any age. I mean, the classic one is Confucius saying about the I Ching, if I had another 70 years to study it, I think I might actually understand this book. And he was 70 when he said that.
it,
Um, those things definitely come up. I mean, I experience them. I'm in my 70s, and there's stuff like, oh, had another 70 or 80 years to work on this. Maybe I'd actually get it correctly. Um, you definitely have those feelings, and occasionally something does pop where, oh, I think I finally got this. I've been working on it for decades, but finally I'm doing it correctly.
until another decade later when you go, oh, wait. Actually, maybe there's another layer of this onion. This is actually was a very strong impression for me in the first couple classes that I had with you back in like something like 2004 was the sense that I was going down a rabbit hole, like Alice in Wonderland kind of a thing. Like this, you don't see the bottom. You can't even perceive where this goes because the sophistication of what you're starting to train, it's like you just have to go on faith to a certain extent. Like, okay, keep working on this expansion compression, keep working on trying to time it with your stepping, uh, keep working on trying to awaken the nervous system because this is going somewhere. I can sense that there is this passage forward, but there is no sense of oh yeah, I see the destination. The destination's just right over there.
Well, the thing with internal boxing that I've tried to tell people for years is there is no destination. There is no end to it. Trying to be completely goal oriented in the study of internal boxing or Taoism is totally self defeating. There is the process, and that's it. The process. The process never ends. That's why Taoism is what it is, the way. The way, as in the road, the path. There is no destination, there is only the way. And it's the same thing with internal martial arts, which follows, it's not that as we went in our religion thing, it's not all that tied to Taoism, but it does have that same concept of if you think there's a destination, at some point you're going to think you've reached it, and that'll be a huge limitation because it's all a process. It's all a never ending traveling along the way. Yes. So there we were on how to develop your own personal practice and a lot more of why to develop your own personal practice. And we'll be back next week, probably with our episode on principles. But I've learned with what came up with that UFC one that you can't really predict. We'll be back next week with something, and eventually we'll be doing the principles of the internal martial arts. And meanwhile, why don't you help us out and do the subscriptions and do the reviews and hit the likes and go to the website, wutangpca.com, and find our classes and look for our books on Amazon and watch our documentary, Tai Chi Club, available on Amazon Prime. And all that good stuff helps us out with algorithms, helps us out with getting the word out there as to who we are and what we do. And we appreciate it a lot. And we'll see you next time. Till then, be safe, be good, practice.
Thanks very much, guys.